Ladies and gentlemen, I'm wanting to welcome you to the Digital Transformation in Government session that's going to be given by Robert Gordon, the Executive Director for the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. And his title is going to be Having a Successful Digital Transformation Journey by Thwarting the Cyber Attackers. Robert Gordon is the Executive Director of the Cyber Threat Exchange, better known as the CCTX. It's Canada's private sector organization for sharing and analysis of cyber threat information and enabling collaboration across all sectors. Most recently, Bob was a director of global cybersecurity at CGI. Prior to this, he enjoyed a long and successful career in the federal government, which included being the architect of Canada's first cybersecurity strategy, for which he received the Deputy Minister's Achievement Award. Bob has a unique career in several Canada's security, intelligence, and law enforcement organizations, Public Safety Canada, Communication Security Establishment, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He held senior executive positions, including the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister level. He was responsible for science and technology, information management, information technology, and internal security programs. Bob has also provided operational leadership in investigating and analyzing the full range of threats to the security of Canada, which included the CSIS, the Canadian Centre for Intelligence and Security Counterterrorism Program. Bob's also a member of the Board of Directors for Quantum Safe Canada, a member of the Advisory Council on the Modernization of Microdata Access across Statistics Canada, and the Advisory Board for the Master of Cybersecurity and Threat Intelligence Program with the University of Guelph. I'm looking very much forward to the presentation, and now it's over to you, Bob. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me. The digital transformation journey needs to be informed by the cyber threat landscape. Unfortunately, and it appears that the slides are not changing. Bob? There we go. Unfortunately, the activity of the cyber threat actors risk derailing that journey. When that happens, you stop delivering the benefits of the digital transformation. This morning, what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about the cyber threat environment, what's been changing in it, talk a little bit about collaboration and sharing of cyber threat information and how that can help in creating a cyber resilient organization that enables digital transformation. And finally, wrap up with the example of the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange as an example of where the private sector has come together to work on collaboration and sharing that enables that cyber resilience. When we started this year off, all of the indications were the predictions for business risk going into 2021 were all fairly consistent. And they included the cyber risk as one of the key ingredients contributing to that risk. And when you look at the other two, they're looking at things like business interruption, pandemic outbreak, obviously. And there's a real strong linkage between us going as a highly globalized and interconnected world and cyber incidents. It's all coming together. And when you look to Canada, last year, at the end of last year, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity released its National Cyber Threat Assessment. There were four of the key judgments are here, and of particularly noteworthy, I thought, for today, was that the comments about cybercrime being the most likely threat, but that the activities of state-sponsored programs coming from countries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea still pose the greatest strategic threats to Canada. And at the same time, cybercrime continues to be the cyber threat that's most likely going to affect Canadians and Canadian organizations. In the past few weeks, the concern of the leadership from Canada's Cyber Centre is still focused on the impact of cybercrime on Canadians and Canadian businesses. And if we thought this wasn't sufficient warning, I think we just have to look back at this week. Lots of activity. We've got the G7 leaders coming together to actually ask Russia to urgently disrupt cyber threat gangs or cyber ransomware gangs that are believed to be operating within its borders. And then yesterday, the leaders of both Russia and the United States, including addressing cybercrime, it was so important they included that as their first on the first agenda of the meeting. Important, significant event. I'm going to spend now a few minutes just highlighting some of that cyber threat environment. Cybercrime has now become a business. And as we start to move into using new technical solutions, we're having to do that at a faster pace. And in the process, we're taking on more risks than we normally would as businesses. Unfortunately, the threat actors know that we're taking this on, and they're effectively traveling with us on that journey. We've now got ransomware gangs that I call professionalizing the cybercrime industry. Gang members are becoming specialized. Some of the hackers develop and market ransomware. Others develop the hacking tools and then sell them off to other criminals who actually launch the attack, while others are actually specialists in conducting the negotiations with the victims. These attackers are all opportunistic. They follow the money. As an example, last year, within a week of the government offering assistance to Canadians financially, financial institutions started to see the gangsters actually going out and offering, and fraudulent check schemes starting to hit onto the waves very quickly thereafter. And unfortunately, the chances of cyber criminals getting caught are pretty limited. And cyber business, as I say, is becoming extremely complex and highly successful. And ransomware attacks are continuing to grab the headlines. A few years ago, they were mainly interested in business disruption. They would go in and encrypt your data. And now what we're starting to see are what we're calling double extortion demands, where prior to them actually encrypting your data so you can't use it, they actually steal it. And then what they do is start to put some of that information out in a threat that if you don't pay your ransom, we're actually going to release more of it. And it's affecting Canadian companies all of as well. This isn't just international. This is certainly hitting Canada. And at 67% of the cyber incidents last year in Canada, ransomware was part of it. And just over half of all of the victims are actually paying that ransom. And there's been a dramatic increase in the size of those extortion demands. Fortunately, recently, we're seeing fewer companies actually paying it, but I'm going to talk about a couple of companies that have actually paid significant amounts to doing it. And last month, we started to see a new trend where the attackers will then start to not only go and try to put pressure on the original victim, but they will actually start to push the notice or the information out to the consumers, starting to threaten them. If you don't get your organization to pay, we're going to release your data. And the attackers are becoming very creative at finding new ways to increase pressure on the victims to pay the ransom. I mentioned the new trend where they actually now go after the victim's customers with the threat of releasing more of the customer's information if the customer doesn't convince the victim to actually pay it. And in Europe, we've seen attacks on healthcare organizations where the criminals threaten to release the victim's information. So they've actually gone to the victims and said, if you don't make this payment, if you don't get the organization, the healthcare organization to make this payment, we're going to release your healthcare information. Certainly not a worrisome trend. And one of the real big questions is, do you pay or not pay? And we could spend a whole day having a very interesting philosophical discussion about that, but there's a few things we should note in this. First of all, we're dealing with criminals, and therefore you can't be guaranteed what's going to happen. You don't know, is that decryption tool that they give you actually going to work, or how effectively is it going to work? And the stolen data they took, are they actually going to destroy it when they say they will? And there's always a risk they're going to come back and you'll be re-victimized. They already know you're willing to pay, will they come back and do it again? And we've also seen instances where even if you pay the ransom, they may walk away from your money and actually not decrypt the data. And unfortunately, we've had an example of one Canadian company that actually had that happen to them. And in some jurisdictions, actually paying ransom or facilitating ransom payments actually may be considered as a crime. We're not sure how effective that's going to be, but that's where some of it's going. And the message I want to leave with you is the whole question of, are you going to pay or not pay? This has to be a conversation that you have with your board or your management team before you get in the situation of being subjected to a ransomware attack. And Canada is not immune to this. We're amongst one of the top companies that are being impacted by ransomware. We could talk about that in terms of it's because we use technology so much. It's impacting hundreds of Canadian businesses. We're starting to see trends in Canada where the scale of the ransomware operations and the size of the payments is going up. And the problem is paying the ransom is just part of the cost of the attack. You've still got to get into the recovery stage. You've still got to you may have to hire people to come in to assist with you. You've got legal costs, communications costs. You've got the notifications you've got to do to customers, to regulators, to suppliers, to employers, to say nothing about the cost of the business interruption and potentially having to replace your technology. This can become a very expensive proposition for you. And businesses are starting to see the benefits of this convergence of the information technology and operational technology. It certainly increases efficiency and supports your long-term planning, but there's also, we're seeing this manifested as a large business risk. A lot of the operational technology or OT systems were never designed to be connected into the corporate systems or to the internet. And a lot of instances, some of that technology is pretty old, and it's impossible to add on cybersecurity at this point. And what happens is a cyber attack coming into your office, your corporate IT systems, there's the risk of it migrating into your operational technology. And when that starts to happen, the cyber attack becomes a matter of business continuity. Are you going to be able to stay in business? And let's look at a couple of examples of that. You're certainly all familiar with the attack that occurred against Colonial Pipelines a few weeks ago. What the ransom attackers wanted to do is they want to commit fraud. They want to get money from you. One of the unintended consequences, perhaps, out of this was that the company had to shut down the pipeline. The attackers may not known of linkages that may be occurring within the company between what's going on in the operational side and in the information technology side. But it has real world consequences. And it costs us the company a lot of money, as we've seen, even though they've recently been able to retrieve some of what they paid. But the ransom, as I say, is only part of what the cost is. At about the same time, there was another noteworthy attack that occurred against the JPS meat processing company. Again, unintended consequences of an attack going into one area, one country. They thought they were tracking into Brazil, spilling over into the United States and into Canada. And in that instance, JBS has now reported that they paid $11 million worth of cryptocurrency to the cyber attackers. So these are real world consequences that are happening to cyber attacks. And closer to home, in the last couple of days, the Humber River Hospital in Toronto experienced a ransomware attack that impacted the hospital's ability to deliver patient care. So this isn't just talking now about information. This is actually having, as I say, real world consequences. And we've seen lots of talk in the last while about the vulnerability of some software. Certainly the recent example that reinforced that concern was the attack by the Russian intelligence service against the SolarWinds software. You're all probably familiar with that. But we also need to be considering the whole of the business that you're involved in. So who are your suppliers of your goods and services? You know, the people that actually keep your business operating. What you may have to be doing is starting to think about what's their vulnerability, what's their susceptibility to a cyber attack, because if they get attacked and go out of business, that's going to have a huge business impact on your operations. And so this may start to have a requirement for a discussion between the business lines in a company and the IT group to get a broader understanding of what's their cyber risk environment and what can they accept as a risk. And unfortunately, the other attack vectors haven't gone away. Distributed denial of service attacks are still very much alive and well and fostering. We've seen a recent trend in the last few weeks of where the attackers are coming in, and before they actually launch a DDoS attack, they're actually coming in and trying to extort a payment that says, if you pay us this ransom, we won't launch the DDoS attack. A new trend. We're not sure how successful this approach has been, but it reminds us of the creativity of criminals looking for new ways to fraudulently be taking their money. And as I mentioned before, this is real in Canada. 21% of Canadian businesses in a study that was done by Statistics Canada have reported being impacted by a cybersecurity incident in 2019, last year when the complete survey was done. But last year, 28% of respondents to a survey done by the Conference Board of Canada saw that during the pandemic, they had a 28% increase in the cyber attacks were coming to them. And when you think about it, when you're walking down the street, That's 1 in every 3 businesses you walk by has been hit by a cyber incident. And that's a fairly sobering number. And the costs of that are continuing to go up, both in terms of the cost of both the breach and the ransomware. And a survey done by the Canadian Internet Registry Authority, the organization looks after the .ca domain, in their survey last year, they found 38% of companies didn't even know whether they'd experienced a breach of customer or employer data. Their systems just didn't allow them to do that. So some of the reporting that we're seeing above may actually be underreporting what the actual incidence is of cyber breaches and cyber attacks. And small businesses in Canada certainly are vulnerable to cyber attacks. A lot of them just don't have the defenses that they need to prevent cyber attacks from coming through. A lot of them don't have insurance to help them get through the recovery stage of dealing with a cyber incident and get themselves back into business when they go through. And nearly 20% of them have been affected by a cyber attack in the last couple of years. And so cybercrime is not just a technical problem. This is now a critical business risk issue. And you may be starting to think that the criminals are winning and there isn't anything we can be doing to stop the attacks. But before you rush to your virtual window and scream, "I give up," the private sector has realized that there are things that it can be doing to start to tip the scales back into our favor. They're working together. They're collaborating and sharing because it's proven to be an effective method to mitigate the cyber threat. We found that collaboration actually increases cyber resilience. Information sharing is really cost effective. You don't need to do it all on your own. You can benefit what other people have done. It also helps you to enrich the information that you've already got because you want to make that actionable. You want to do something with that information. It's not just the point of collecting it. And companies are now reporting that sharing of threat information actually improves their corporate cyber resilience. And that they can actually they've done some really good assessment now, that you can actually put dollar value on the savings that you can incur when you're actually involved in cyber threat sharing, when you're actually having to deal with a data breach. And quite frankly, in a lot of instances, cyber attacks can be prevented or thwarted because organizations become involved in the sharing of cyber threat information amongst themselves. The whole objective of this is how do we increase the cost to the attackers while reducing it for us? As I mentioned, cyber resilience is what we want to do, and sharing helps to do that. And we're seeing lots of research now coming out where getting involved in this activity is very effective at preventing, detecting, containing, and responding to attacks. And one of the interesting things that we're starting to see now is that sharing across sectors actually provides some unique insights. There's certainly some parts of technology that companies are using that's unique to them, but a lot of the systems that underpin, certainly in the IT, the corporate space, a lot of those systems are not unique. They're the same across hundreds of different types of organizations, and you can benefit from those outside of just your particular sector that you're actually operating in. And getting involved in threat sharing is now becoming best practice. And so you've got in the United States, for example, US Department of Defense has released their cybersecurity maturity model certification process. And any of you involved in the defense sector will certainly be aware of that. And one of the requirements in there actually talks about when you get to level 3 is getting companies participating in threat sharing forums so that they increase their situation awareness. Very beneficial to, again, creating that cyber resilient organization. But we're also seeing the same recommendations coming out in Canada. Things like the Investment Funds Institute of Canada, the Canadian Association of Defense and Security Industry, and the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization are all recommending that getting involved in information sharing is a very helpful, if not essential, tool in helping to mitigate cyber threats and to make it just basically a safer place for your organization to be operating. And that brings us to what can be happening in Canada and what can we do about it? And so what's happened is I've been talking about the threat environment, what was going on, And this led the private sector to create the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, or CCTX. Our mission is pretty simple. We want to provide a facility where organizations can get together to collaborate to reduce the financial, operation, and reputational risk through giving access to timely, relevant, and actionable threat information. It sounds pretty simple, and to some respects, it actually is. And what we're seeing is 180 organizations have now come together and are now starting to work on a cross-sector basis. It involves organizations of all sizes and all types. And it's an environment where professionals can get together to share best practices and share cyber threat information. And we're kind of unique because we've done it in a true Canadian fashion where we bring together the whole community. In Canada, we've got a history of getting together and working together to take on common problems. CCTX is a good example of this. And we're set up as a not-for-profit organization, which when you think, for example, all of the 7 big banks of Canada all belong, to think of them actually participating in not-for-profit, it sometimes gets a little confusing, and we get into some interesting discussions about the vocabulary we're using, but we are a not-for-profit organization. And what we're trying to see, and the adage I like here, is none of us are smart as all of us working together. So let me just spend a minute here trying to describe a little bit about what we're doing. So when we get to talk about what does information sharing start to look like, and how do you do it, and how does collaboration work, what we're doing is arranging a series of activities that go on, everything from weekly threat calls, where cyber threat analysts will get together every Wednesday afternoon and sit down and talk about what are they seeing, what are the threats that are hitting them right now, what are the kinds of things that they need to be thinking about. And occasionally what we'll do is, in response to a major incident happening, we'll quickly pull a call together. And we did that, for example, when SolarWinds attack, we had over 100 analysts sitting on the call saying, okay, how big a problem is this? What are the kinds of things that we need to be doing right away? Is anyone seeing something different than what I'm seeing, and describing what that is? So it's a very quick way for cyber threat analysts to start doing some of that quick benchmarking. So when they start to provide their advice up in their organization as to, do we need to ratchet up more our response, or can we pull it back a little bit, they're in a position to be able to say, okay, our company's approach is fairly consistent with what others are seeing. We also run technical webinars. Again, this is where we bring in industry experts to talk about what are the main things that are going on in the industry. What's some of the new technology coming down the road? What are some of the new challenges, and what are some of the new technology that might be able to address that? We run working groups where companies will get together and talk about common threats that they've got, but delve down deeper into that. It's like creating a neutral space where they can come together. A lot of these companies are quite active competitors. I've got telecommunications companies that are very active competitors amongst themselves. And this is a space where their employees can get together and talk about things that are in common. Because the thing we don't want to be happening is the public, our consumers, our customers, to start losing confidence in the fact that the system is working. We need to be keeping that system working. The founders of the CCTX, the chief executive's office, when they got together and said, okay, we want to create this entity, they all had the common belief, and we're structured that way, that everyone should have a common understanding of what the cyber threat environment is. That should not be a competitive issue. We need to have that common understanding so we can be building up resilience across the entire sector. Now, obviously, companies, they will compete. They'll compete on the goods and services, the products that they provide. But that core understanding of what the threat is, we have to share that. And we want to be trying to do that. We want to get people together to talk about that. We also share discussion papers. So companies will be putting into our secure portal discussion papers on things that they're seeing, or companies will be looking to say, I need to be writing up some new procedures in doing this kind of activity. Does anyone have something they can share? It's really then effective because the receiving company then just needs to fine tune that for their particular needs. but they're not having to spend all the time and energy and resources to go through. And particularly when you're talking about smaller or medium-sized companies that haven't got a lot of those resources, this is a very cost-effective way to be able to do that. And one of the other pieces out of that is when organizations are participating in that activity, again, particularly for the medium and smaller companies, the time that their analysts or their employees are spend in some of this activity actually counts towards the educational hours that they need for their professional certifications. And again, particularly at a time when companies are under a lot of economic pressure coming through COVID, employees are their valuable asset, but they may not have the funds to be able to send them off to maintain some of their accreditation. This is a very cost-effective way for them to be able to do that. And as a member-based organization, all of the activity, all the things we're doing, the interest, the types of activity we're involved in, is all driven by the members. What's the value that they see out of it? What are the challenges that they're facing today? What do they need to be thinking about as they go through that process? As I mentioned, we do this in a variety of ways. So a lot of it, obviously, for the last year, we've been doing virtually. We've been doing it online. Our last in-person event was a year ago, February. Fortunately, we snuck that in just under the wire before the lockdown occurred. But we've now converted over into virtual sessions, the same as what we're on today. We had over 100 registered to attend our events this past February. We are now, we'll be kicking a series of those back into play over the next few months. And we're hoping that by next year, spring, hopefully, we'll be able to return to a blend of in-person events and continuing on with some virtual, because virtual has the opportunity to bring together particular organizations and their employees that may not have the funds to be able to travel to attend events. So we'll always continue on to have that blend. And we're going to start running sessions at the end of the day. So get together on a Friday afternoon to compare best practices on the years, and we'll be doing that across country. We had started to roll that out, get ready to roll that out last spring, and we had to put that on hold as a result of COVID. And what we're trying to do when we run these events is not run it as a typical symposium. What we want to do is make this interactive. We want to make this as discussions where members are getting together to talk about what are the threats and how can they respond to it. We'll have people there that will facilitate that dialogue. And it also builds up trust. And trust is a critical component when you then start to get into the question of the sharing of cyber threat information. We receive cyber threat information from a variety of sources. Certainly our what we call subscribers or our members provide information into us. They provide things like indicators of compromise. They can provide that in either an electronic format using something like sticks and taxi, so they can do it in an automated fashion. For smaller, medium-sized companies, they can actually put it in a narrative format. So send us an email, and we will extract the data out of that. It goes into our secure portal. We call it the data exchange, where we have some analysts that then take that data and start to produce a variety of types of reports. The idea, the fundamental underpinning of that is how do we get actionable information into the hands of companies so they can actually start to take some defensive action to stop the attackers that we've been talking about, stop them from getting into it and increase cyber resilience. And we're very fortunate to have an extremely close working relationship with the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. It was established just over 2 years ago. They've been very forthcoming in providing both technical expertise and data, and they also contribute their threat information into us, which we then combine with what we're getting from our subscribers, and we provide that out, and we become that clearinghouse. But it's also an opportunity for the private sector to be giving the government, in this case the Cyber Center, an indication of what are the kinds of threats that they're seeing. And they do that in an anonymized way. So we don't go along and say, company X has actually provided this information, but we can give that information back to the federal government so they get a broader understanding of what's the threat landscape, what's affecting Canadian businesses, so the government in totality can be sitting down and saying, okay, are there new policies, procedures, or things that we can be doing to assist the private sector in better defending themselves? And we also have a relationship with an organization outside of Canada where they give us every morning their take on what's coming in. So we get that early warning site coming in. But what we want to be doing is looking at the global threat environment and then start to put in a Canadian lens on it. What does this mean for a Canadian business? Because if you follow any of the news feeds on this, you could be just drowning in threat information coming in. And what we want to do is make that easier for the threat analyst that's sitting there that's swamped with this data coming in. How do we make their job easier? How do we try to narrow that scope down a little bit and say, look, here's the kinds of things that you've got to be thinking about. Here are the things that are actually impacting into Canada and potentially impacting on your business. Again, the idea is how do we create or increase the cyber resiliency looking across Canada. And cybersecurity is all about people. Behind these attacks, it's people. But people are not only the thing that's behind and creating the problem, people are also part of the solution. And you have to be looking at this from three perspectives. It's people, it's process, and it's technology. And as cyber professionals, we need to be looking at those three vectors because the attackers are going to be looking at you and saying, okay, I'm going to come knocking on your door. I'm going to come knocking on the people door, the process door, the technology door. And I don't care which one of those doors you leave open, that's the door I'm going to come in. And so what we want to be thinking about when we're looking at this whole threat landscape is to be having the view of the people, the process, and the technology piece when you go through, because it becomes critical. It's the underpinning of it. And I like this example. This took a while for the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation to come through and actually be able to identify the 4 members of the Chinese People Liberation Army that were involved in the Equifax hack. It's now, forget that it seems that long ago, it's now 4 years ago. But earlier this year, they were finally able to go through and identify who were the people sitting on the keyboards that actually launched that attack. And were then able to identify them, and they've now put them onto their most wanted list. I think their chances of actually being able to bring any of those individuals to justice in the United States is pretty remote. But it does serve to emphasize with everyone, certainly it does with me. It goes back to, this is a people business. These are people at the other end. Governments are now starting to think about how do we start to do or raise the bar between countries. We're starting to see discussions occurring certainly within the G8 or G7 rather. We're starting to see discussions between countries, realizing that governments have got to do more to get involved in this, so we can start to differentiate between those things where it's the government activity that's launching the attacks, and I'm thinking back to SolarWinds, versus what are the pure cyber criminals coming after and doing it, and how do we go after the cyber criminals to start to reduce the attractiveness for them coming through. Because when you're looking at the cyber attacks, there's 3 elements to it. It's motivation, capability, and opportunity. And one of the key factors in ransomware is the motivation, and that's because it's profitable. So what are the kinds of things we can be doing as countries, as nations, both individually and amongst us and between each other, to start to reduce the financial attractiveness of undertaking these cyber attacks, and thereby starting to make it easier for us to be defending. Then move into the second realm, which is then what's the appropriate role for nation states when we start looking at the norms of behavior. And there's some conversations that have been running for a while in the United Nations as a way to start to bring that to fruition. We're hoping that will continue on. And certainly I'm encouraged by the conversation that seems to be what the early reporting, at least, of what we're seeing in the conversations that were occurring between the presidents of Russia and the United States yesterday. And I think we can go a long way to start to reduce that risk to all of us. So with that, I'd like to wish you well all on your digital transformation journey. And I believe we've got some time left to entertain any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. That was a fantastic presentation. Much appreciated. And certainly in an area that's not that Well, it's understood, but not well understood. Okay, for that. So I've got a series of questions for you, and what I'll do is I'll just paraphrase them in there. Uh, is right now is part of the Cyber Threat Exchange organization. Uh, does the Center for Cybersecurity, Canadian Center for Cybersecurity, have a seat at the table?
Yes, I do. They've got a
Yeah,
very important seat at the table. They actually, so we have a board of directors of 15 people on the board from some of the biggest companies in Canada, but we also have 4 permanent invitees. And the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity, one of their executive actually sits on that as part of that group. So they attend all of our board meetings, as does an executive from Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada.
super. For that, okay. How about if we take a look at? There's a question: is how common are state-sponsored cyber threats?
That's a difficult question to answer, and I'll come back and explain sort of why. Attribution of who the attacker is always a difficult process to go through. It's one of the reasons why countries are reluctant to do that. I think the report that I mentioned earlier that came up from the Cyber Center at the end of last year was actually the first time where the government of Canada has come through and identified those 4 countries as being behind some of those attacks. So it's a complicated process that they don't do it a lot. And some of the time, it actually becomes difficult to measure the difference between a cybercrime, an organized cybercrime organization doing it either on directly on behalf of a nation state, or the nation state just tolerating or letting that cybercrime organization undertake some of the attacks. And we've seen some examples of that this year. I mean, the SolarWinds attack is a good example where the government of the United States has gone through and identified the Russian intelligence services as belonging to that. And then there were attacks when we look at the attack at JBS, the meatpacking plant. That's another instance where an organized crime group identified in Western Europe with a lot of ties back into Russia. In that instance, it looks like it's more just the organized crime group operating in those countries, but tolerated or appears to be tolerated by those countries. So it becomes at times it become a very difficult juggling to try to decide who's actually behind it, who's organizing it, and who's permitting it, and who's actually undertaking the operation.
Okay, thank you. Let's say is does your organization also look at software virus trends, or do you focus specifically on security breaches and vulnerabilities?
Uh, we do a little bit of both. It's more what the members are seeing in their discussions as to do they want to actually take a look at that part of it. And certainly there's discussions that going on. So a lot of what we do is actually facilitating dialogue. So we're kind of unique. We're a very small organization, but we're an enabler of companies to get together. So if that becomes an issue that companies are facing, then we'll facilitate either bringing people in to talk about it. We'll create environments where they can sit down and have those conversations. So it's the professionals getting together and say, okay, what do we need to be looking at as we go through.
Okay, sorry, there's quite a few questions all of a sudden popped up. Um, okay, thank you. And I think there's an interesting question here, and that is, are there any important non-technical cybersecurity skills?
Oh yeah, lots of them. I mean, a lot of the threat analysts look at the problem from 2 perspectives. Certainly, from a technology perspective, I say looking at it from the zeros and ones perspective, a big challenge of it. But there's a couple of other elements going through it as well. As I mentioned, this is a people business, and one of the things that we're having to look at is start to think about there's people behind this system, and so you're going to need people with psychologists sitting down saying, okay, how do we start to understand the human side of the cyber threat environment? There's also a huge opportunity for within the IT department in the cyber threat environment is how do you start to translate what you're seeing in that threat environment into business language? You've got to be able to make this understandable to the business side of your organization so they can be better prepared, so you get the funding to actually increase. And that's a business skill. That's not an IT skill. And certainly when I'm talking to chief information security officers or chief information officers or chief security officers, and the labels vary between companies, that ability to bridge the vocabulary, the dialogue between the IT side and the business side is a critical, or it's sometimes the most important side of it. And certainly when you get into when incidents start to occur, being able to articulate in a non-technical way to boards of directors or your communications group or your legal team, or quite frankly to your employees and the rest of the business, that's critical. You've got to be able to do that. And just having a technical skill is helpful, but you've got to involve the rest of the other components as well. My background is not technology. I use technology. I look at the people side of it. So I can look at one of those three pillars that I talk about. You then want to bring in somebody that can talk about the technology piece. You also need to talk about trainers. How do you actually take the lessons learned from what the IT department is saying and create an environment where you can go through and start to train your employees on what to look for when phishing attacks come in, what to look for when you're writing policies and procedures when you go through that. So there's a huge breadth of skill sets that are required in broadly defined the cybersecurity business, not just technology.
Okay, great. Thank you. You've answered that question very well. All too often, everybody thinks about bit twiddling, but policies and procedures are often much more, just as effective, if not more so sometimes. Okay, to what extent is quantum computing on the radar as the next serious cyber threat?
It's increasingly on the radar, both at the industry level, but also at the government level. I mean, what companies are now starting to think about is how do they start to become quantum resistant as they go forward. So what are the algorithms that need to be put in place so that, because what we're worried about is at some point in time in the future, and there's a lot of discussion of when that day will actually come, but a fully effective, fully functioning quantum computer will have the ability of being able to decrypt things that that you'd like to be keeping secret that are encrypted now, that 10 or 15 years out, you'll be able to decrypt that. And so if you've got, as an example, if you've got a trade secret, a patent that you spent, a lot of money in developing, and you're looking at a 20 or 30-year lifespan for that technology or that patent, whatever it is. And if you think that 10 or 15 years out, somebody's going to be able to break into your system and decrypt that, then you've got a problem. You've got to start thinking about that now, because attackers are going to be collecting a lot of that data now. And you're saying, okay, it's encrypted. They can't do anything with it, so they stole it. But if they can decrypt that in a few years down the road, all that data that they've been saving now becomes a risk. So there's quite an effort underway to start to come up with quantum safe algorithms. The National Institute for Standards in the United States has been running a project for the last several years. They're expected to come out later this year with a standard on what that should look like. So yes, it's very much on the radar of certainly of large organizations, but increasingly of medium and mid-sized organizations, and certainly on the radar for government organizations. Quantum Safe Canada, the group to which I belong, that's a collection of both business, academia, and the government sitting down and talking about, how do we start to raise the awareness of the quantum risk that's coming along. Obviously, lots of benefits, but there is a risk, and how can we be prepared for that and take advantage of that when it comes along? And Canada's in a great position. We have some great thought leaders in quantum computing. We don't take a backseat to anybody on this. We've got both at the academic level and the private sector level. So we've got a lot of really talented people in Canada looking at this problem and starting to set us up for success. And quite frankly, it's also a bit of a business opportunity. That capability that we're developing on the quantum side also is a good business opportunity. And we want to be capitalizing on that and showcasing what Canada is able to do over the next few years.
Okay, thank you. The next question, and this is sort of a follow-on to Rachel's presentation just preceding yours, is with technology evolving so rapidly, artificial intelligence, cloud, etc., how does data residency in cloud impact our data vis-a-vis to cyber attacks via third parties?
Yeah, I was on a call last week with some experts actually looking at that problem, and in some respects, you could make a good argument that data residency is starting to become less of an issue. Now, there still is some requirements to it, but there's some thoughts that there may be some other ways to start to mitigate that risk. For example, encrypting the data. And if you can encrypt the data where it's at rest, where it's in the cloud, then the residency issue becomes less of an issue. You'll always want to be thinking about potentially where the cloud is, but it may not be that it just has to be within this geographic boundary in a province. Just picking as an example, there may be some latitude as we start to move forward and we start to look at residency. And the other part of it is organizations are starting to realize, both certainly from a legal standpoint, that when you put things into the cloud, that doesn't alleviate your responsibilities for it. When something happens in the cloud, you're the data owner is the one that's going to be answering for it. So it's starting to make the owners of data starting to think about it, having a dialogue with the cloud providers on what kinds of security are in there, where's my data sitting, how's this being stored. And I think that dialogue is going to start to get us to the point where things like ensuring things are, your data is encrypted in the cloud will start to have a spin back when you start to look at the data residency question. So I think that's going to become more of an active discussion in the next very short period of time, next year or two.
Well, thank you very much. And it's when all these risk management experts want to transfer risk, it doesn't quite work that way. You're still accountability is still there. Thank you. Um, okay, we've got some other questions here. Uh, what are the top three industries with the most exposure to cyber threat like ransomware? And what have they done so far to mitigate that?
Well, I think some of the big industries that are being attacked, if you think certainly in the pandemic era, and you're looking at ransomware, the attackers want to go through and put pressure on companies or institutions where they're most vulnerable, where they can't afford to be down, because that increases the pressure to make the payment. And so some of the obvious ones are broadly defined healthcare organizations, hospitals. Hospitals can't afford to be down, so there's a huge pressure on them to have to pay. Certainly, attackers go after financial institutions. They continue to do that. So those are probably sort of number one and two. And the second is into universities, second post-secondary education. And for a couple of reasons. One is they're doing a lot of research on, for example, on dealing with COVID. A lot of intellectual property that's in there, and that's very attractive for some countries or organizations to want to go after. Again, putting pressure on those organizations to pay. So I mean, those are probably close to the top three. There's a long list because you're starting to see they're going after, the attackers are going after, who do they think can actually pay? So if they get an indication that they think you're willing to pay, then you're going to be attacked for that reason, because you got the perception to pay.
Okay, next question. Sorry, I hope you don't mind. We're going to go a little bit over, but I think that we've got a barrage of questions right now for you there,
Certainly.
Robert. Can you recommend any way for someone without a technical background to learn and become involved in cybersecurity? I think you sort of answered that before.
Yeah, I would think. I mean, right off the bat, I mean, there's certainly a gap in the number of people that are required in the cybersecurity environment versus what the supply of people coming into it. Uh, there's lots of organizations out there that are actively searching for companies. I know one organization that what last year sometime they had 300 vacancies on a range of skill sets, and not all of them our technical skills. So I think just starting to apply in certainly bigger companies, but there's a lot of service providers, managed service providers that are out there. Canada's got some very large managed service providers out there. I won't identify any of them by name, but I used to work with them. You know, they've got a global, they have a global presence, and they're always looking for skilled people. You know, everything from varying types of analysts through to the very deep technical skill.
Okay. This is sort of a different one. Um, if individuals are exposed to some cyber, personal threats, can they report that somewhere in the cyber threat exchange?
We're not a sort of an incident reporting
Okay.
system. They could certainly report it into the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity um, at the federal government level, or
Yeah.
there is the Canadian Fraud Center reporting up. And there's a good synergy between the Fraud Center, the new Cyber Center I was talking about, but also into the center that was established in the RCMP, their National Cybercrime Coordination Unit. And it's really encouraging to see the federal government has actually come together. So whichever one of those three organizations you report into, that they will share that across. So they'll make sure you don't have to figure out ahead of time, was this the right organization to go into? They'll sort that out behind the scenes. If it should have gone into another organization, they'll pass it along. So it's a really good a good example of where the government is looking at this holistically and acting holistically in that process.
Okay. Just some other questions here. Uh, Total cost of cyber threat, basically within North America, in the 5 or 10 years. Reference what are the potential threats, but also the costs that you can foresee for hardening and making people more aware and applying cybersecurity within their organizations. Is there sort of an overall cost figure of what cybersecurity will entail within organizations itself in the private sector?
I haven't seen a cost number coming with that, in part because it varies so much between organizations. I mean, some of the cost features are actually not that expensive. You know, some cyber training you can do fairly cheaply. I mean, there's certainly services you can buy, but some of that you can do internally. Some of it is actually just doing some basic hygiene coming through, like updating software systems. That's it can sometimes be complicated accepting that, but that's not necessarily a huge cost factor, in particular for smaller organizations where you're not running a lot of different kinds of software. And at the personal level, uh, I update my system every time Microsoft sends out a patch. I update it right away. That doesn't cost me anything. It comes with my service. So the cost range varies. Certainly in some bigger organizations, when you start to get into financial institutions, big manufacturing plants, their cybersecurity is more expensive because their systems are far more complex, and there's more things involved in it. There's more pieces of their systems that connect to one another. So there's a bigger cost there. It's just become part of doing business now.
Yeah, there are some questions that you just won't be able to answer because of their sensitive nature. But this one might be, but this is sort of the last question. Um, what types of cyber responses available to effectively respond to nation states' norms of behavior? Um, and then you maybe talk about the aggressive counterattack stance as well. Um, I know there's policies to Canadian government. Can you just elaborate on some of that too?
Yeah, I mean, if I can get, I think what the question's driving at is what's in the toolbox that governments have in dealing with it, and certainly at the one end, it's trying to deal with it in the traditional criminal way and getting collaboration going. Second is how can you establish some norms of behavior amongst countries to ensure that they're following what some acceptable norms, and saying, for example, it's not acceptable for a nation state to be targeting the critical infrastructure in another country. So there's some conditions that you can put onto there to start to minimize or put into a box the capability of nation states to be going after it. And at the other end is when those first couple of steps aren't working, are there activities that nation states can undertake to start to mitigate that risk? And certainly that included in that capability is being able to reach out and deny or degrade the capability of somebody who's actually attacking you. And that's the kind of thing that gets put into legislation that would allow cryptologic agencies to actually be able to do that in a defensive way. What you want to be doing is going through those first things, first steps, first activities, because that's the hopefully the broader and the better way to be doing it. But at the end, nation states have to and have the right to defend themselves.
At the nation state level, but companies are not allowed to counterattack, correct?
That's correct. This is a nation state, and it's you want to really know what you're doing, and before you would do that, again, I talked about the unintended consequences of a criminal attacker coming in. A nation state trying to do that activity would certainly have that same concern and would want to be thinking about it very carefully because of those unintended consequences. And that's not what private companies are in the business of doing. If you're in the business of making widgets, that's what you do. You're not in the business of trying to figure out if I'm going to do a cyber attack in another country, excluding the fact that it may be illegal. But if you're trying to do that, that's not what your core competency is. Leave that to people that is their core competency. Let them do that. They're responsible for it, and make sure you're producing your widgets or your services, whatever it is that you're doing, the most effective way you can, and keep your resources focused in on that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Robert. It was a great presentation, and the questions, like I said, they keep on flowing, but I think this is an area of concern for everybody.
Thank you very much.
This sort of thing. So I wish you all the best with Cyber Threat Exchange, and I'll be talking to you with respect to partnerships with professional associations like the ISACA and the like, and see how we can help, and also in academia at the University of Ottawa. But anyways, thank you very much for your time. Greatly appreciated. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to wrap up the session. I just want to let you know this afternoon we've got the European Union. Dr. Abril is going to be presenting on how to select public service implementation orientation. It's basically a client-facing orientation for public services. Then Greg Richards from the University of Ottawa. Dr. Richards is going to be presenting on analytics-based results management. Then we have a stream approach. Concurrently, we'll be having a human-centric approach in a complex and emotionally charged environment. I alluded to that earlier, and Rachel is, how do you deal with the mental health of your employees? Amarjit Kaur, who was formerly with Public Service and Procurement Canada, and they were able to put together apps to help their employees. Concurrently, Christian Sauvé from the Public Service Commission is going to be talking about establishing a business-driven enterprise architecture practice in a smaller government agency, which, believe it or not, from what I've seen, is much more efficient and effective than sometimes in larger organizations. To wrap up the day, we've got Dr. Vic Pant from Natural Resources Canada, who's a chief scientist and chief scientific advisor, and he'll be talking about science and policy integration. And that's sort of the NRCan Digital Accelerator and the Technology Readiness Assessment. I look very much forward to seeing you this afternoon. Thank you again, Robert, for the presentation on the CCTX. It's evolved tremendously since our first presentation we had from you, I believe, in 2018. Okay, for that. So with that, I'm going to be ending the session in a few moments. I have to wait until the latency in the streaming stops. Good.